Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I am your host, Jeff Hansen. As always, the show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Please, if you have not done so yet, take a minute, subscribe to the channel, like this video. We appreciate your support. It means the world to us. As we begin week 4 of this new platform, the support so far has been phenomenal and overwhelming. Thank you to each and every one of you, and thank you in advance for those of you who are subscribing to the channel today for the first time. Today, we're going to kick off the week by turning to AI to help us talk a little bit about BYU football. That's right, folks. We're turning to ChatGPT to identify the top 10 BYU football players of all time. The prompt was simple, a very succinct question. Who are the top 10 BYU football players of all time? And from there, ChatGPT took it on its own and spit out the results. And if these are the kind of results that AI is currently garnering, I think we have a few more years before we need to worry about some kind of iRobot situation where they come out to get us. And we're all going to lose our jobs to the robots. I just don't think it's quite there yet based on these results. So let's just get into it. The top 10 BYU football players of all time, according to ChatGPT. Number 10, Mark Wilson. I think there's an argument to be made that Mark Wilson should be in the top 10. I don't think most people would consider Mark Wilson as a top 10 player of all time. Certainly in the conversation of, one of the top 5-7 quarterbacks of all time. But when you start throwing in defensive players and other offensive players, I don't think Mark Wilson cracks the top 10, but absolutely one of the most influential players in BYU football history, given his early adoption to the passing game with Lavelle Edwards, and he was kind of a pioneer of that quarterback position. Number 9, Dennis Pitta, who I think has a case to make as the top tight end. There's one or two other guys who I think would love to stake claim to that title, but Dennis Pitta checks in at number 9, according to ChatGPT. Little high. It's probably a little high for Dennis Pitta, but absolutely one of the best playmaking tight ends that BYU has ever had. One of the best pass catchers that BYU has ever had. I don't know if he's the 9th best player in general, but if you were to dissect this and say just the offense or just pass catchers, then absolutely Dennis Pitta is on the short list of names that you're going to talk about. Number 8, Luke Staley. For anybody who's around my age, Staley is probably the guy who made you fall in love with BYU football. That 2001 football season was absolutely electric. First-year head coach turned to Brandon Doman and Luke Staley and said, hey, just go win us a bunch of football games. And that's exactly what they did. They didn't play any defense in 2001. I mean, literally, there was no defense to speak of. And Luke Staley and Doman still led that team to 12 wins. As soon as Staley went out with an injury, it was a completely different BYU football team. That team was built around running the ball and built around running the ball with Luke Staley. He was absolutely spectacular. I think he has a strong case to make for a top 10 football player in BYU history. Number 7 is a little head-scratching. Ziggy Ansah checks in at number 7, and I get it. He was drafted high by the Detroit Lions, but he was drafted high based off of his potential, and I think ultimately he lived up to that. If he could have stayed healthy in the NFL, he would have been one of the better pass rushers for about 10 years. But his production at BYU wasn't there. He was a walk-on. His story's phenomenal. It's an all-time story. A walk-on who had come to BYU from Ghana to play basketball, only to end up on the football team not knowing how to wear pads. Once he figured all that stuff out, in which direction, the helmet went and the pads went, then yeah, I mean, he turned out to be a pretty productive player. But if you look at what he did at BYU, it was all little flashes of greatness as he figured out the game of football. He didn't become the electric pass rusher until he was in the NFL. So that one's a head scratcher for me. Number 7 seems really high. Number 6, another one that I go, well, okay. Harvey Unga checks in at number 6 on the all-time list, according to ChatGPT. I think Harvey Unga has a strong case to make as the top running back in BYU football history. Jamal Williams would like to lay claim to that. Luke Staley, of course. Tyler Algier, who now holds the single season rushing record at BYU. So there's other guys who I think would be in the argument. And I don't think any of those guys you're looking at any of them saying top 10 player of all time, except for maybe Staley. So Unga at number 6 seems really high, but a phenomenal player. And now he's doing great things on the coaching staff at BYU. So his impact is certainly very high and very much top 10-ish. Number 5, Gifford Nielsen, kind of like Mark Wilson. Giff is probably underrated by most BYU fans, including myself. He was one of the pioneers of the position for BYU who helped turn Lavelle Edwards and that passing game into what people think about today. But I don't think he's a top 5 BYU football player of all time. Maybe at the quarterback position, maybe he's a top 5 quarterback, but even then, I don't think so. So this one seems really high. Number 4, AI is supposed to like weed through the humanity of these kinds of lists, but they pulled an internet blogger move here. They picked Lavelle Edwards as the 4th best football player in BYU football history. But they recognized and they did acknowledge that, hey, he didn't actually play at BYU. Of course, he coached at BYU. If this was a list of the most influential people to ever come through the BYU football program, there is no doubt about it. Lavelle Edwards is number 1. But this is supposed to be players. A creative liberty like this is something that we do in the blog world when we can't think of off-season content. ChatGPT is supposed to cut through all of that stuff, and instead they throw a coach onto the top 10 players list. And that's the kind of move that makes me feel like iRobot is still decades away. Even ChatGPT couldn't come up with enough content to fill out a whole list of players like it was supposed to. Number 3, Ty Detmer, BYU's only Heisman winner. He was great that year. He threw for a bajillion yards. He threw for a bunch of touchdowns. He also kind of threw for a lot of interceptions, but like, hey, that happens. Ty Detmer was electric when he was at BYU. He orchestrated maybe the best win in BYU football history over then number 1 Miami. Ty Detmer was a legend in every sense of the word. He was a legendary player for BYU. I have no issues with him being in the top 3. Number 2 is maybe one spot too low for me, Jim McMahon. Jim McMahon he took what Gifford Nielsen, he took what Mark Wilson, he took that foundation that was laid before him, and he turned BYU's quarterback factory into a true factory. He helped win BYU's first bowl game. He played with swagger. He set NCAA records, and then he went into the NFL and he continued that success with the Chicago Bears and ultimately won Super Bowls. Jim McMahon was phenomenal, and in my opinion, is without a doubt the best football player to ever come through BYU. So he's one spot too low for me on this list. That top spot belongs to Steve Young, according to ChatGPT. And Steve Young, it's hard to argue against Steve Young. He certainly deserves to be up there. If you look at the entirety of what he has done during his football career, he won Super Bowls. He's in the NFL Hall of Fame. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame. He's great. I have no problem with Steve Young being at the top of this list. If we're splitting hairs and we look just at what they did at BYU, I love Steve Young's story. 6th, 7th string quarterback trying to play safety. Coaches didn't want him on the offense, only to end up becoming Steve Young and going into the Hall of Fame. It's a phenomenal story, but I don't know that Steve Young is my top player. I think I would have probably put him at number 3 with Jimmy Mack at 1, Ty Detmer at 2, but there's a case to be made for any of those top 3 guys for sure. So what did you think? ChatGPT, I don't think they got it right. They didn't talk about a lot of players. There was no mention of a Kyle Van Noy, a Fred Warner, a Mo Elewanibi. There was no talk about a Rob Morris or any of those defensive players from the 80s and 90s that were so important to some of BYU's most important teams. There was no Max Hall, no Jaron Hall, no Zach Wilson. I mean, not even a mention of any of these other players. That's tough. It's tough for me when you say Harvey Unga and Harvey Unga and Ziggy Ansah are on the list, but you're not going to talk about Jamal Williams or Austin Collie or Cody Hoffman. So I think ChatGPT was flawed, but I do think it got the top 3 right. What do you guys think? Thank you for your support so far. We appreciate everything that you do for us here at The Daily Dose. And until next time.